The night my husband told me to go sleep in your storage unit, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because at 51 years old, standing in my sister-in-law Diane's Scottsdale living room while she poured $280 bourbon into crystal tumblers, I realized something cold and irreversible. I had spent 3 decades being the responsible one and somehow ended up the disposable one. Rachel wouldn't understand, my brother-in-law Derek said, smiling at the investors seated around the long walnut table. She's more of a paperwork person. Laughter followed, soft, polite, cutting. My husband, Greg, didn't defend me. He adjusted his tie and said, "Well, at least one Caldwell knows how to think big." That was the moment. That was the fracture. And it only got worse. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, died 6 weeks earlier. Ovarian cancer, swift and merciless. She had been a quiet woman, methodical, a machinist who spent 38 years operating precision equipment at the Oakland Naval Complex. She didn't believe in flashy things. She believed in land. When the will was read, Derek received a lakefront property in Sedona that Mom had purchased decades ago before the desert real estate market exploded. I received a commercial storage facility near the old industrial corridor in Fresno. Derek had leaned back in the leather conference chair at the attorney's office and said, "Mom knew you like structure, Rachel. Steel, concrete, something solid." He said it like a compliment. The facility was 12,000 square feet of faded siding and fractured asphalt. The Sedona property overlooked a red rock canyon. Derek insisted it was equal. "Market value fluctuates," he said. "And honestly, you're not exactly lakefront material." I didn't argue. I rarely did. Because my role in this family had always been simple. Absorb tension. Fix problems. Balance books. Derek built image. I maintained stability. That evening at Diane's house was supposed to be a celebration of legacy. Derek had already refinanced the Sedona property, added a deck and solar panels, and hired a brand consultant. He was hosting potential investors for a real estate fund he called Caldwell Desert Capital. Greg was glowing under the recessed lighting. He had always admired ambition, especially Derek's version of it. I stood near the end of the table, hands loosely folded, listening to Derek explain leverage ratios with confidence he didn't fully possess. One of the investors asked, "What happened to the industrial property I saw listed in the probate filings?" Derek smirked. "Oh, that thing. It's basically scrap concrete. Rachel took it. She's always been good with storage." Laughter again. Greg said lightly, "She'll probably turn it into a spreadsheet." The investors chuckled. Someone clinked a glass. I felt heat climb my neck, but I kept my expression steady. I have audited procurement chains in Arizona heat and Illinois winters. I have testified before regulatory boards. I know how to sit still while someone underestimates me. But humiliation inside your own marriage is a different temperature. After the guests left, the house grew quiet. Desert wind pressed softly against the glass walls. Greg stood by the kitchen island, arms folded. "You didn't say much tonight." "I wasn't asked much." He sighed. "Derek's trying to build something. You could at least act supportive." I paid property taxes on that facility for years while Derek refinanced his property twice. That's different. How? Because Derek has vision. There it was. The word I'd been competing with for 15 years. Vision. "And what do I have?" I asked. He hesitated. "Stability," he said finally. "But stability doesn't grow." I watched his face. The subtle disappointment he no longer tried to hide. "You know what investors see," he continued. "They see momentum. They see risk-taking. They don't see someone who double-checks invoices. I protect us." "From what, Progress?" The conversation felt familiar. A rerun with sharper edges. Then he said it. "You're 51, Rachel, and your biggest asset is a condemned storage facility. It landed heavier than I expected. I kept us out of debt, I said quietly. You kept us small. Silence. Desert wind again. Then he walked to the front door, opened it, and said, maybe you should figure out who you are without leaning on Derek's shadow. I didn't move. He looked at me, not angry, not hysterical, just finished. If that facility means so much to you, he added, go stay there tonight. He didn't shout. He didn't slam anything. He simply closed the door after I stepped outside. The lock clicked. Clean. Final. I stood on the walkway for a full minute, watching the reflection of the house in the dark glass. Inside, Derek was laughing at something on his phone. I checked my pockets. Wallet, phone, keys. The facility key was still on my ring. I drove the 31 miles to Fresno in silence. No music, no calls, just the low hum of freeway tires and the echo of Greg's words. Your biggest asset is a condemned storage facility. When I pulled up, the industrial district was asleep. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavement. Port cranes stood like skeletal giants against the night sky. The facility gate creaked when I unlocked it. The rolling steel door groaned upward with resistance. Inside it smelled like oil, dry air, and old dust. I stepped in. The concrete floor was cool under my shoes. Empty space. Shadowed beams. No canyon view. No investors. Just 12,000 square feet of silence. I let the door roll shut behind me. The echo lingered. For the first time that night, my breathing slowed. I walked to the center of the floor and looked up at the metal trusses. Condemned facility, I muttered. Then I saw it. A thick envelope taped to the inside of the breaker panel. Property tax notice stamped 2 days earlier, and beneath the classification line in bold municipal print, industrial multi-use subsurface easement, active. Subsurface easement. I stood there longer than I should have. Derek had handled most estate communications. Why hadn't he mentioned that? I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The air inside the facility felt different now. Not warmer, not colder, just unfinished. I dragged an old tarp from the corner and laid it flat. Used my folded jacket as a pillow. And as I lay there staring into the dark rafters, one thought pressed steadily into my mind. Derek never came here. Not once in 5 years. He never looked behind walls, never opened breaker panels, never read municipal classifications. He saw rust. I saw language. And language is where ownership lives. I closed my eyes. Not defeated. Not yet. Because somewhere between the word condemned and the word easement, something didn't add up. And I have built my entire life on noticing what doesn't add up. I woke before sunrise to the sound of metal ticking. For a moment I didn't remember where I was. Then the smell hit me. Dry heat, rust, engine oil baked into concrete. The industrial district was already warming, the air heavy even at 5:30 in the morning. A faint orange glow leaked through the high, grimy windows, cutting the darkness into long geometric shapes. I sat up slowly on the tarp, joints stiff, and listened. Storage facilities have a language. Pipes contract. Roof panels shift. Wind hums through seams. If you stay still long enough, the building tells you whether it's stable. This one wasn't dying. It was quiet, yes. Neglected, certainly. But structurally intact. I walked to the breaker panel and opened it again. Subsurface easement, active. The phrase bothered me. In procurement auditing, vague language hides leverage. You don't label something active unless something is flowing through it, physically or financially. I ran my hand along the conduit lines feeding into the main panel. Several breakers were labeled in faded marker. Lighting. Dock power. West office. Zone D, port feed. Zone D had a small red dot next to it. Not factory labeled. Hand marked. I pressed my fingers against the metal casing. Warm. Not hot, but warm. At 6 in the morning, in a building with nothing running, that shouldn't happen. I flipped open the tax envelope again and read the classification line carefully. The legal description referenced Parcel 51C and something called a subterranean right-of-way filed in 1998, the year Mom expanded the facility. The year she stopped talking about selling it. I pulled out my phone and searched county records. Eventually a scanned deed surfaced. There it was, an attachment I had never seen before. Right-of-way granted to Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems for fiber routing and secure utility conduit. Fiber routing. Secure conduit. Not storage. Not industrial infrastructure. I sat back on my heels. Derek had sold half the story to himself. He saw land. Mom saw access. By 9 in the morning, the sun had turned the metal siding into a slow oven. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck as I dialed the utility company listed on the breaker panel. After navigating automated menus, a man named Kevin picked up. City Grid Services, how can I help? I'm reviewing usage on an industrial parcel in Fresno. Parcel 51C. He typed. Ma'am, that meter isn't on city distribution. It isn't? No. That building is fed through a private industrial substation. It's a legacy connection. Legacy how? Connected to Port Authority infrastructure. You'd need to contact Pacific Rim. Does it bill monthly? Yes, through a state title holder. Has it been active? A pause. Yes, ma'am. Continuous draw. Continuous, as in 24-hour consumption. Yes. Has anyone disputed it? No, ma'am. I thanked him and hung up. Continuous draw. Not fluctuating. Constant. Data doesn't lie. Someone or something was operating beneath this building. Around noon, a black SUV rolled up outside. I didn't need to check the window to know who it was. Derek stepped out wearing sunglasses and a linen button-down like he was arriving at a marina, not an industrial corridor. He didn't knock. He never knocked. The rolling door groaned open, sunlight slicing into the interior. What the hell are you doing, Ratch? He said, stepping inside and immediately wiping sweat from his forehead. It smells like a railyard funeral in here. I slept, I said evenly. You're serious. Greg told me you stormed off. I didn't storm. He waved it off. Look, I don't care about domestic drama. What I care about is this. He tossed an envelope at me. Final notice. Utility account delinquent. Amount due, $9,218.44. 9,000? I asked. It's been accruing. You're the one living here now. I've used zero electricity. Not my problem. Transfer the account into your name. I'm not carrying dead weight. Dead weight? I looked at him for a long moment. Have you ever checked the meter? I asked. He laughed. It's a warehouse, Ratch, not a server farm. Have you ever reviewed the deed attachments? He rolled his eyes. I hired people for that. Did you read them? He stepped closer, irritation tightening his jaw. You think Mom left something hidden? Is that what this is? Some fantasy where the quiet sister finds buried treasure? I didn't answer. He misread silence as surrender. Look, he said, lowering his voice. I have a buyer lined up for this land. Mixed developer. They'll clear it. Build condos. I need clean title. No delinquent bills. When are you closing? 3 weeks. And have you disclosed subsurface rights? He blinked. What rights? Easements. Infrastructure. He scoffed. It's junk pipe under dirt. Relax. Junk pipe. I walked to the breaker panel and opened it. Feel that, I said. He hesitated, then pressed his palm against the metal. It's warm, he said reluctantly. Nothing inside is running. So something under it is. He pulled his hand back like he'd touched something contagious. You're overthinking this, he snapped. Transfer the utilities, clean it up, or I'll have the meter disconnected and the building condemned officially. That would require disclosure, I said. He narrowed his eyes. You always do this, he muttered. You complicate simple things. No. I clarify them. He turned and walked back toward the sunlight. As he reached the door, he said without looking back, you were always better at cleaning up messes than making something real. The door rolled shut behind him. The building hummed faintly in the heat. I walked back to the breaker panel. Zone D, port feed. Subsurface easement active. 3 weeks until closing. And for the first time in years, Derek was moving faster than he understood, which meant he was vulnerable. I pulled out my phone and searched Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems. The name redirected to a subsidiary, which redirected again, eventually landing on a federal contractor page. Secure routing services. Defense-compliant fiber networks. Subterranean hardened vault systems. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied. Because this wasn't buried treasure. It was leverage. And leverage, when misfiled, becomes ownership. I looked around the facility one more time. Derek saw scrapland. Greg saw embarrassment. But beneath my boots, below concrete and rust, something expensive was running 24 hours a day. And neither of them had ever asked why. The next morning, the heat arrived early. By 8 o'clock the inside of the facility felt like the interior of a parked car in August. Light filtered through the grimy windows and pale strips, illuminating dust that hung in the air like suspended time. I had moved my tarp closer to the east wall where there was at least the illusion of shade. The utility notice sat open beside me. $9,218.44. Derek's handwriting was scrolled across the top in blue ink. Transfer immediately. I studied the detailed usage graph printed on the second page. Flat. Perfectly flat, not a peak, not a dip. In a normal structure, power consumption breathes. It rises when equipment runs, falls at night, spikes during use. This line was a ruler drawn across the month. High draw, constant. That wasn't lighting. That wasn't refrigeration. That was infrastructure. I zoomed in on the billing details. Source classification, industrial substation, pre. There it was again. Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems. I searched deeper. Corporate registry filings. Federal subcontract disclosures. I traced the paper trail the way I would trace inventory leakage in a supply chain. Pre wasn't a warehouse utilities vendor. It was a hardened fiber contractor tied to defense routing redundancies along the West Coast. In plain English, secure communications running under my facility. I leaned back against a stack of old shipping pallets and closed my eyes for a moment. Mom had never trusted banks. She trusted land. But land connected to data, that was something else. Around noon, a white city pickup truck pulled up outside. I hadn't called for one, but Derek had. A woman stepped out wearing a municipal vest with the logo of the Fresno Utility Authority stitched on the front. She introduced herself as Sandra Reyes. Got a transfer request and possible disconnect notice. You the current occupant? I'm the co-heir, I replied. Rachel Caldwell. She nodded, scanning the breaker panel. You running equipment? No. She opened the panel and checked the feed. Her eyebrows rose slightly. That's odd. What is? This feed isn't city supplied. It's patched through a secondary industrial grid. Rare these days. Who maintains it? She hesitated. Technically Pacific Rim, but those lines are under federal classification. We don't touch them. Can it be disconnected? She gave me a look. You can't just unplug a government backbone because your family's having a dispute. Sandra checked the meter housing outside. She ran a handheld scanner across it and let out a low whistle. This is pulling consistent load, heavy but stable. That's climate control or server-grade draw. There are no servers here. She tapped the side of the unit. Then they're not here. Off the record, buildings like this near the port corridor sometimes got retrofitted in the late 90s for redundancy vaults. Earthquake-proof routing chambers. Climate-stabilized fiber channels. Private contract stuff. Accessible from inside, usually through a sealed interior access point or external hatch. She paused. You planning to sell? My brother is. She nodded slowly. Well, whoever buys it better read the attachments. After she left, the facility felt different. Not mysterious. Defined. There's a difference. Mystery implies fantasy. Definition implies paperwork. I walked the perimeter slowly, studying the floor. If Mom had granted subsurface access in 1998, there had to be a maintenance portal somewhere. I found it near the west wall, a square steel plate flush with the concrete, painted over, almost invisible unless you were looking for seams. 4 recessed bolts. I crouched down and brushed away dust. Stamped faintly on the metal, pre-access, authorized personnel only. My pulse remained steady. Emotion clouds judgment. Documentation clarifies it. I stood and called the estate attorney listed in Mom's probate file. Margaret Osei answered on the 3rd ring. Rachel, is everything all right? I need to review the original 1998 easement filing. There was silence on her end. You found something? She said quietly. I found language. She sighed. Your mother insisted that attachment remain intact. Derek tried to classify it as obsolete. Is it? No. Another pause. Rachel, that easement includes annual lease compensation tied to federal infrastructure use. The payments were structured to route through the estate trust until both heirs confirmed distribution. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. How much? Escalating annually. The last disbursement I saw was 5 years ago, before your mother consolidated accounts. It was approximately $195,000 that year. I stared at the steel plate on the floor. Where did the payments go? Redirected to a dormant estate account pending confirmation of ownership structure. Your mother wanted to protect it from liquidation. Derek submitted incomplete documentation twice. She refused to sign off on sole ownership before she passed. Why? Because she knew the value of what was below the facility. I felt the shift then. Not excitement. Not revenge. Alignment. Margaret, I said carefully, if Derek attempts to sell without disclosing subsurface rights, it would constitute misrepresentation. Substantial liability, yes. I ended the call and sat down on an overturned crate. For 30 years, I had been the quiet one. The cleaner. The fixer. The one who double-checked. Derek built image. I read attachments. Greg chased momentum. I traced clauses. Now, the clause was beneath my feet. 3 weeks until closing, and Derek had just threatened to disconnect a federal utility line, which meant he was operating blind. Blind men move fast. Auditors wait. I ran my hand once more over the steel access plate. Pre-authorized personnel only. Mom hadn't left me a storage facility. She had left me a conduit. And for the first time since Greg closed that door, I felt something unfamiliar but precise. Control. The steel access plate stayed in my line of sight for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't open it. Not yet. Curiosity without authority is trespassing. And I had spent my career avoiding trespass, legal, financial, emotional. Instead, I drove to downtown Fresno and walked into Margaret Osei's office. She had represented my mother for almost 18 years. Soft-spoken, meticulous, the kind of attorney who read footnotes before headlines. Her office smelled faintly of paper and sandalwood, a contrast to the dry heat I'd been breathing all morning. She didn't waste time. "You've seen the utility draw," she said as soon as I sat down. "Yes." "And you found the access plate?" "Yes." She folded her hands. "Your mother insisted on very specific language in the 1998 agreement. She believed infrastructure would outlast market cycles. Derek thought it was obsolete. Derek never read it." She pulled a thick file from a cabinet and placed it in front of me. "Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems, Subterranean Lease and Right-of-Way. Stamped, Federal Defense Subcontract." I flipped through the pages slowly. Term length, 30 years, renewable. Annual lease payments with 5-year escalators. Non-disclosure clauses. Emergency access rights. Buyout provision based on infrastructure replacement cost. I stopped at the payment schedule. Year 1, $80,000. Year 5, $115,000. Year 10, $155,000. Year 15, $195,000. Year 20, $240,000. Year 25, $320,000. We were in year 25. "Has it been paid?" I asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "But after your mother consolidated accounts, payments were directed to the estate holding trust pending final beneficiary confirmation. And that confirmation never happened because Derek submitted incomplete documentation twice. Your mother refused to sign off on sole ownership before she passed." "Why?" "Because she knew the value of what was below the facility." I leaned back. Derek had been racing to refinance the Sedona property, to expand, to leverage, all while sitting on a contract that generated more stable income than any speculative real estate fund. "Can Derek legally sell the land?" I asked. "He can attempt to," she said carefully. "But any buyer conducting proper due diligence would uncover the subsurface lease. And if he doesn't disclose it, he exposes himself to litigation." I nodded. "If Derek wanted to avoid liability," I said slowly, "could he transfer subsurface rights to me?" "Yes, even if he doesn't fully understand their value. As long as it's written and executed properly." I closed the file. For years, Derek had operated on momentum. Deals made quickly. Documents skimmed. Confidence weaponized. He had always assumed I would correct whatever he overlooked. This time I wouldn't correct it. I would let it stand. That evening Derek called. "I have the developer flying in next week," he said without greeting. "They're offering $460 for the land." "Just the dirt and steel?" "Yes." "And subsurface?" He exhaled sharply. "You're obsessed with that." "Because it exists. Rachel, nobody cares about a buried fiber line from the 90s. Federal contractors care." Silence. "I need the title clean," he continued. "Utilities, contents, anything that complicates inspection, gone." "And if there are complications?" "There aren't." I let him fill the silence with his own certainty. "Transfer the interior contents to your name," he said finally. "All of it. Scrap fixtures, whatever's left. I don't want liability after closing." "In writing?" "Yes, obviously in writing. Include subsurface rights." He paused. "Why would I include that?" "To protect yourself." He scoffed. "From what?" "From federal misrepresentation." The word federal slowed him. "You're exaggerating." "Then you have nothing to lose." A long breath. "I'll draft something," he said. "Good." When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. The next morning, he emailed a document. Transfer of interior contents and associated structural elements for liability purposes. He had written it himself. Sloppy but binding. All fixtures, attachments, mechanical systems, and associated structural rights not expressly reserved by seller. He hadn't expressly reserved subsurface rights because he didn't think of them as rights. He thought of them as plumbing. I printed the document and drove it to Margaret. She read it twice. "He's transferring more than he realizes," she said. "Is it enforceable with notarization?" "Yes." We met Derek at a coffee shop near the Civic Center. He wore sunglasses indoors. He signed without hesitation. "Congratulations," he said lightly. "You're officially the owner of a pile of rust." I signed. We notarized. He shook my hand as if he were doing me a favor. On the drive back to the facility, I felt something settle. Not anger. Not revenge. Gravity. I parked inside the gate and stood over the steel access plate again. This time, I unlocked it. The bolts came loose with steady resistance. When I lifted the plate, cool air drifted upward. Not refrigerated, controlled. A narrow steel ladder descended into a concrete chamber illuminated by soft indirect lighting. I climbed down slowly. The room below wasn't large, maybe 20 feet wide, but it was immaculate. Fiber conduit racks lined the walls. Climate control units hummed quietly. Sealed equipment cabinets bore federal compliance tags. On one wall, a metal plaque read, "Redundant Secure Routing Node, Central Valley Sector." There it was. Not treasure. Not fantasy. Infrastructure. Quiet. Expensive. Invisible. I ran my hand along one of the conduit housings. It vibrated faintly. Alive. Above me, the facility groaned in the afternoon heat. Below me, the future of data transmission flowed without interruption. Mom hadn't left me a burden. She had left me leverage. I climbed back up, replaced the access plate, and secured it. Then I called Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems. A woman named Celeste Huang answered. "I'm calling regarding Parcel 51C, I said. Silence, then careful interest. "Yes? I'm the current rights holder." Another pause. We were under the impression ownership was unsettled. It was. Now it isn't. She cleared her throat. "We have been attempting to route lease payments for several years." "I'm aware." There was a subtle shift in her tone. "Are you interested in maintaining the agreement? Or discussing a buyout?" "Discussing," I said. "Good," she replied. For the first time in decades, someone spoke to me not as an afterthought, but as the controlling party. When I hung up, the facility felt different again. Not lonely. Not condemned. Activated. Derek was preparing to sell scrapland. He didn't know the land wasn't the product. It was the platform. And he had just signed it over. The closing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Derek texted me the details as if I were a delivery service he'd hired. 10 o'clock. Valley View title. Be there to confirm vacancy. Vacancy. That word would have amused me once. Now it sounded reckless. For the next 5 days, I moved deliberately. Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems sent 2 representatives to the facility, not in black SUVs, not in secrecy, but in pressed button-down shirts and quiet efficiency. Celeste and her colleague Marcus arrived with a compliance officer named Tobias Renfrew. They wore no badges of authority beyond the calm that comes from knowing you are protected by federal contract. We stood over the steel access plate together. "You have documentation?" Celeste asked. I handed her the notarized transfer. She read it slowly. "All associated structural rights not expressly reserved by seller," she murmured. She looked up at me. "Your brother did not reserve subsurface." "No." Tobias nodded once. "Then we are speaking with the correct party." They descended into the chamber and conducted their inspection. I stayed above, listening to the muted cadence of professional conversation below the concrete. After 40 minutes, they climbed back up. Ms. Caldwell, Celeste said carefully. We have been holding 5 years of escrowed lease payments pending confirmation of beneficiary. How much? I asked, though I already had an estimate. $2,614,000, including escalation and penalties for delayed routing. The number did not hit me like a lottery win. It landed like validation. The buyout? I asked. Tobias stepped forward. Based on current infrastructure replacement cost and redundancy value, we would propose a buyout at $4.1 million for subsurface rights only. Yes. And the land above? No operational concern to us. Derek was selling the land for $460,000. He had signed over rights worth nearly 10 times that without reading. I'll consider the buyout, I said evenly. Celeste nodded. Until then, lease payments will resume quarterly to your designated account. After they left, I stood alone in the facility again. Sunlight filtered through the high windows. Dust still floated. Nothing on the surface had changed. But beneath it, value was flowing. That evening, Greg called. His voice was softer than it had been in weeks. Derek says you're being difficult about the sale. I'm being precise. He's under pressure. He chose that. Silence stretched between us. You've been gone almost a week, he said. Yes. This isn't sustainable. What part? You living in a storage facility. I'm not living in it. I'm evaluating it. He exhaled. You always turn everything into analysis. And you always turn everything into momentum. He didn't respond. I didn't mean what I said, he added finally. Which part? About you being small. I let the quiet sit. Greg, I said gently, I was never small. I was stable. There was nothing left to argue about. Thursday arrived clear and bright. Valleyview Title occupied a glass building overlooking the Civic Plaza, a place designed to make transactions feel clean. Derek was already there when I arrived, leaning against the reception desk, sunglasses pushed up on his head. Ready to unload your palace? He joked. I'm ready to confirm paperwork, I said. The developer, a man named Calvin Price, shook my hand firmly. Industrial conversions are hot right now, he said. You two sitting on a gold mine. Derek laughed. Not this one. We moved into the conference room. Documents were laid out in careful stacks. Calvin reviewed disclosures. Then he paused. Subsurface infrastructure? He asked. Derek waved dismissively. Obsolete fiber lines. Nothing active. Calvin looked at me. Active? He asked. I met his gaze calmly. Lease active. Payments current. Derek turned toward me sharply. What are you talking about? Calvin's attorney leaned forward. Ms. Caldwell, if subsurface rights are active under a federal lease, this property cannot be transferred free and clear without disclosure and assignment. Derek's face lost color. That's ridiculous, he said. It's scrap conduit. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were the notarized transfer Derek had signed, pre-lease confirmation, escrow release statement, and federal compliance acknowledgement. Calvin's attorney read quickly. Silence thickened. Derek, Calvin said slowly, you represented this parcel as unencumbered. It is, Derek insisted. It isn't, I said quietly. His head snapped toward me. You knew? He asked. I read the attachments. Calvin closed the folder. This deal cannot proceed under current representations. We will require full infrastructure disclosure and reassessment evaluation. Derek's composure cracked. You transferred liability to her, he said, pointing at me. She owns the contents. Not liability, I corrected. Rights. Calvin's attorney spoke carefully. The executed document transfers subsurface structural rights. That includes easements unless expressly reserved. Derek looked as though the air had thinned. You can't be serious, he whispered. I am, I said. The room shifted subtly. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Just decisively. Derek had built his identity on control, and for the first time, he had miscalculated publicly. Calvin stood. We'll be in touch, he said. The developer and his attorney left. Derek remained seated. You did this on purpose, he said. No, I replied. You did. He stared at the table. You were supposed to fix things, he said quietly. I always did, I answered. Outside, the Civic Plaza shimmered in late morning light. Inside, the documents lay between us. Calm. Legible. Final. Derek had chased leverage. I had followed language. And language had won. Derek didn't speak for nearly a full minute after the developer walked out. The conference room felt smaller without the illusion of momentum. Sunlight poured through the glass wall overlooking the plaza, bright and indifferent. People moved in slow arcs across the courtyard below as if nothing significant had just shifted. You set me up, Derek said finally, his voice low. I remained seated. No, I said calmly. I asked you to read. He leaned back in his chair, running both hands through his hair. The confidence he wore like a tailored blazer had slipped. What remained was something closer to panic. You could have told me, he said. I did. You didn't say it was worth millions. You didn't ask. He stood abruptly and paced toward the window. $460,000, he muttered. I had that lined up. That would have cleared the bridge loan. The bridge loan. Of course. Derek had leveraged the Sedona property against projected sale proceeds from the facility. He had been counting money he didn't fully understand. I can still fix this, he said, turning back to me. We'll renegotiate. Split the subsurface buyout 50-50. It's no longer 50-50, I said evenly. He blinked. What does that mean? It means you transferred subsurface structural rights to me. Not liability. Ownership. His jaw tightened. That document was about scrap. It wasn't. You knew I wouldn't read it carefully. I didn't answer. Silence is often the most honest response. He exhaled sharply and looked toward the door as if expecting someone to rescue the situation with a technicality. No one did. We left Valley View Title separately. Derek's car pulled out fast, tires chirping lightly against the curb. I drove back to the facility. The industrial district looked exactly the same as it had the night Greg closed the door behind me. Port cranes in the distance. Trucks rumbling through intersections. Air thick with salt and exhaust. But the difference wasn't visible from the street. It was beneath it. Pacific Rim Infrastructure Systems called that afternoon. Celeste's voice carried measured satisfaction. We understand the attempted sale has been suspended. Yes. Would you like to proceed with buyout discussions? I would. We scheduled a formal valuation meeting for Monday. That evening, Greg came to the facility. He stepped carefully over cracked asphalt, shoes not designed for industrial ground. The sun was setting behind the port cranes, casting long shadows across the concrete. He paused at the open rolling door and looked inside. You're really staying here, he said quietly. For now. He walked in slowly, scanning the rafters, the concrete floor, the stillness. It's not safe, he said. It's stable. He stopped a few feet in front of me. Derek says you sabotaged the deal. I disclosed what he ignored. He's under a lot of pressure. He created that pressure. Greg folded his arms, not defensively, thoughtfully. There's talk of a lawsuit, he said. I expect there will be. He hesitated. And the subsurface rights. They're mine. His eyes searched my face for exaggeration. There's a federal lease, I explained. 25 years active. Escrowed payments. How much? Enough. He swallowed. And now? Now I decide whether to continue the lease or sell it. The evening air cooled slightly as the sun dipped lower. Greg walked toward the center of the facility and turned slowly in a circle. I thought this place was worthless, he admitted. Most people only see what's on the surface. He looked at me carefully. I didn't mean what I said. You meant it, I replied gently. You just didn't understand it. Tears welled briefly in his eyes. Not dramatic. Not performative. Just quiet realization. I wanted momentum, he said. I offered stability. I thought stability was small. It isn't. We stood there in the fading light, surrounded by steel and silence. I don't know what happens next, he said. I do, I answered softly. Monday came with clean paperwork and numbers. Pre offered $4.1 million for full subsurface buyout. After taxes and legal structuring, I would clear just over $3.1 million. Quarterly lease payments were no longer necessary. The buyout would be immediate. I signed, not quickly, not impulsively, but decisively. The funds cleared within 72 hours. Derek called the following week. His tone was no longer sharp. It was strained. The developer backed out, he said. They're claiming misrepresentation. I'm aware. The bridge loan is due. I'm aware. You're just going to let this happen. I'm not letting anything happen. He inhaled shakily. You always said we were family. We are, I said calmly. This isn't how family acts. Silence. I can fix the Sedona property, he continued. Refinance. Recover. I just need time. Time is expensive, and you have it now. Yes. He didn't ask for money directly. He didn't need to. The request hung between us. I'm not your safety net anymore, I said quietly. He didn't argue. He simply hung up. A month later, I moved into a modest house inland. Nothing flashy. Nothing coastal. Paid in full. I started a compliance consulting practice focused on infrastructure audits and municipal contract review. Work that required reading attachments. Work that required patience. Greg and I began couples counseling, not to restore what we had, but to understand what it was. Some structures can be reinforced. Others collapse under their own assumptions. The facility still stands, converted now into mixed industrial office space after I retained surface rights and leased it properly, disclosed, documented, valued accurately. Sometimes I drive past the port at night. The cranes still loom against the horizon. The air still smells of steel and dry heat. And beneath the concrete of that facility, data still moves, just no longer tied to my last name. Derek chased image. Greg chased momentum. I followed language. And language, in the end, defined ownership.